Dr. Amara Mitchell adjusted the rearview mirror of her silver Honda Accord as she pulled into the Norfolk Federal Courthouse parking garage. At 45, she carried herself with the quiet dignity that came from 2 decades of pediatric practice in underserved communities. Her navy blue blazer and matching slacks were conservative yet professional, the careful uniform of a black woman who had learned that appearances mattered in spaces where her presence was questioned before her credentials were considered. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Today's visit wasn't for her own business. Her stepson, Marcus Jr., a 19-year-old Naval Academy midshipman, faced a minor traffic hearing, a speeding ticket that could affect his military standing if not handled properly. As she locked her car and gathered her purse, Amara mentally rehearsed the character reference she might need to provide, though she doubted it would come to that. Marcus Jr. was a good kid with a clean record. This was simply about showing family support in an intimidating environment. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as federal employees and attorneys streamed through the security entrance. Amara joined the line, observing the familiar dance of courthouse security with the practiced eye of someone who had attended countless hearings as both an advocate for her young patients and a concerned family member. Officer Derek Kozlov stood behind the metal detector, his stocky frame filling out his courthouse security uniform. At 38, his face bore the permanent scowl of someone who had never quite gotten over being discharged from military police 3 years prior. His personnel file, buried in courthouse administrative offices, contained a pattern of complaints about excessive force and racial harassment that should have disqualified him from any security position. Instead, those very complaints had been his qualification for Sheriff Crawford's special placement program, finding positions for misunderstood officers who just needed a fresh start away from the scrutiny of police oversight. Kozlov's eyes swept the security line with predatory assessment, lingering on anyone whose skin color triggered his internal threat assessment protocols. When they fell on Dr. Mitchell, something shifted in his posture. Here was exactly the type he most enjoyed educating about proper respect for authority. Well-dressed, probably thought she was better than everyone else. Definitely the type who would complain to supervisors if she didn't get her way. "Next," he called, his tone notably different from the respectful "sir" and "ma'am" he had offered to the white attorneys ahead of her. Dr. Mitchell approached the checkpoint and placed her purse in the screening bin with practiced efficiency. "Good morning, officer," she said, presenting her driver's license along with her medical association identification card, both clearly displaying her professional credentials. Kozlov examined the IDs with exaggerated skepticism, holding them at arm's length as if they might be forgeries. "Dr. Mitchell," he read slowly, emphasizing each syllable as if testing its authenticity. "And what brings you to federal court today, doctor?" "I'm here to support my stepson during his hearing," she replied calmly, accustomed to such interrogations but always maintaining professional courtesy. "Support?" Kozlov's eyebrows rose mockingly. "Step over here for additional screening." The request was unnecessary. Dr. Mitchell had passed through the metal detector without incident, and her purse contained nothing more threatening than medical journals and family photos. But she complied, stepping to the secondary screening area where Kozlov retrieved the handheld metal detection wand. "Arms out," he commanded, beginning a search that was notably more thorough and invasive than she had observed for other court attendees. The wand lingered over her body in ways that made several bystanders shift uncomfortably, including Rebecca Santos, a 26-year-old courthouse clerk who was retrieving files from the security office. Rebecca had graduated from law school just 8 months ago, taking the courthouse position while studying for the bar exam and dreaming of becoming a prosecutor. She recognized Dr. Mitchell from community health fairs where the pediatrician volunteered her time providing free checkups for undocumented children. What she was witnessing now made her stomach churn with recognition of injustice her professors had discussed in theory, but which she was seeing in brutal practice. "Officer," Dr. Mitchell said quietly, maintaining her dignity despite the degrading treatment, "I've been through security. My identification clearly shows my professional credentials. I'd like to speak with your supervisor about appropriate screening procedures." The request was reasonable, polite, and within her rights. But for Kozlov, it represented exactly the kind of challenge to his authority that he had joined security to avoid. In his worldview, certain people needed to learn their place, and those who questioned his methods needed to be taught lessons that would stick. "You people always think the rules don't apply to you," he muttered, loud enough for her to hear, but quiet enough to maintain plausible deniability. "Always wanting special treatment." Dr. Mitchell's jaw tightened slightly, but her voice remained controlled. "I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for the same respectful treatment I observed you providing to other court visitors. Please return my identification so I can attend my stepson's hearing." Several courthouse employees had begun to notice the interaction, including Rebecca Santos, who instinctively reached for her phone. Her generation had learned that documentation was often the only protection against abuse of power, and something about this interaction set off every alarm bell her legal training had installed.
"When we're finished here," Kozlov replied, his hand moving to the taser on his utility belt in a gesture designed to intimidate, "step back and assume the position for a complete search." Dr. Mitchell remained calm, but her medical training recognized the signs of escalating aggression in Kozlov's posture and tone. "Officer, I've complied with all reasonable security measures. I'm requesting to speak with your supervisor." Instead of de-escalating, Kozlov interpreted her continued requests as defiance. In his twisted logic, she was challenging his authority in front of witnesses, making him look weak. The same psychological profile that had led to his military discharge now pushed him toward a decision that would change multiple lives forever. "Last warning," he said, his voice rising. "Step back and comply with security procedures or face obstruction charges." Dr. Mitchell took a small step backward, raising her hands slightly in a universal gesture of non-confrontation. But even this reasonable response was interpreted through Kozlov's lens of racial resentment and authority obsession as resistance requiring forceful correction. Without warning, he drew his taser and fired. The electrical prongs struck Dr. Mitchell in the chest, sending 50,000 volts coursing through her 45-year-old body. She collapsed immediately, her head striking the polished marble floor with a sound that would haunt the memories of everyone present. Blood began pooling beneath her temple as Kozlov stood over her, momentarily satisfied at having reasserted his authority over someone who had dared to question him. Rebecca's phone captured every second of the assault, her hands shaking as she documented the aftermath of institutional racism turned violent. Around them, courthouse employees stood frozen in horror, struggling to process what they had just witnessed. The silence lasted only moments before someone shouted for medical assistance, but the damage was already done. Dr. Amara Mitchell, respected pediatrician and pillar of her community, lay unconscious on the courthouse floor, the victim of the very system that was supposed to protect her rights and ensure justice. The USS Norfolk cut through the gray waters of the Atlantic Ocean, its massive hull slicing through moderate swells as Rear Admiral Marcus Mitchell observed tactical exercises from the bridge. At 48, he commanded respect through a combination of strategic brilliance and uncompromising integrity that had carried him through 26 years of naval service and made him one of the highest-ranking black officers in the fleet. "Admiral, the destroyer squadron has completed their approach vector," reported Lieutenant Commander Hayes, his voice crisp with military precision. "Requesting permission to proceed with simulated engagement protocols." Marcus nodded, his attention focused on the coordinated movements of 6 vessels executing a complex defensive pattern he had designed. The exercise was testing new theories about asymmetrical naval warfare that could revolutionize fleet tactics, the kind of strategic innovation that had earned him 2 Navy Distinguished Service Medals and a reputation as one of the most forward-thinking military minds of his generation. "Permission granted," he replied, but his words were interrupted by the urgent arrival of his communications officer. "Admiral, urgent call from Norfolk General Hospital," Petty Officer Chen announced, her usual composure cracked by obvious distress. "They're asking for you specifically, sir. It's about your wife." The tactical exercise forgotten, Marcus felt his world narrow to a single point of focus. In 26 years of military service, he had trained himself to compartmentalize emotions, to maintain strategic clarity under the most extreme pressure. But the words urgent and hospital in the same sentence about Amara stripped away decades of professional conditioning in an instant. "Transfer it to my private line," he ordered, already moving toward his quarters. "Commander Hayes, you have the bridge. Continue the exercise." The brief conversation with the emergency room physician provided only essential details. Amara had been assaulted at the federal courthouse, suffered cardiac complications from a taser attack, was currently stable but required monitoring. The clinical language couldn't mask the doctor's concern or the gravity of what had happened to his wife. 30 minutes later, Marcus strode through the corridors of Norfolk General Hospital, his dress blues drawing respectful nods from medical staff who recognized the significance of his rank insignia. Behind him followed Captain Sarah Chen, his longtime aide and strategic advisor, who had materialized at the hospital with the efficiency that made her invaluable to his operations. Dr. Patricia Williams, the attending cardiologist, met them outside the intensive care unit. "Admiral Mitchell, your wife is stable, but the electrical shock from the taser triggered cardiac arrhythmia. Given her age and the stress of the assault, we are monitoring closely for additional complications." Marcus nodded, his training allowing him to process medical information clearly despite the emotional tornado building inside him. "May I see her?" The sight of Amara, connected to cardiac monitors and IV lines, transformed something fundamental inside Marcus Mitchell. His wife, the woman who had chosen civilian medicine over military service to help underserved children, who had supported his career through countless deployments and late-night strategy sessions, who represented everything good and principled in his world, was vulnerable in a hospital bed because someone had decided her dignity was worth less than their momentary sense of power.
"Marcus," she said softly when she saw him, her voice hoarse but determined. "Don't let them bury this." Before he could respond, Marcus Jr. burst through the door, his Naval Academy uniform disheveled and his young face contorted with rage. At 19, he possessed his father's sense of justice, but lacked the strategic patience that military service had taught the Admiral. "They tasered her dad," Marcus Jr. said, his voice breaking between fury and disbelief. "Some racist security guard tasered her for asking to speak to his supervisor. We need to make them pay, right now." Marcus placed a firm hand on his son's shoulder, recognizing the dangerous combination of youthful idealism and justified anger. "We will make them pay, son, but we'll do it the right way, thoroughly, systematically, and permanently." Captain Chen approached with a preliminary briefing folder she had assembled during the drive from the naval base. "Sir, I've gathered initial intelligence on the incident. Officer Derek Kozlov, formerly military police, dishonorably discharged in 2021 for misconduct. The courthouse security position was arranged through Sheriff William Crawford's office, despite the discharge record. The information clicked into place in Marcus's strategic mind like pieces of a tactical puzzle. This wasn't random, it was systemic. Someone had deliberately placed a disgraced military police officer in a position where he could continue abusing civilians, particularly minorities, without military oversight. "Who else knows about this?" Marcus asked, his voice taking on the commanding tone that had directed naval operations across 3 theaters of operation. "The hospital has reported it, as required by law. Local media is picking up the story. The courthouse administration has released a statement about an unfortunate incident and promised a full investigation." Marcus studied his wife's face, noting the bandage covering the head wound from her fall and the determination still blazing in her eyes despite her physical vulnerability. In that moment, he made a decision that would transform a personal tragedy into a systematic campaign for justice. "Set up a secure communication line to our house," he ordered Chen. "Contact Lieutenant Colonel Park at JAG and Master Chief Washington. Tell them we're implementing Operation Accountability." "Sir," Chen questioned, unfamiliar with the operation name. "It's a new operation," Marcus replied, his strategic mind already 3 moves ahead of the current situation. Someone thought they could assault a Navy wife and hide behind institutional protection. They're about to discover what happens when you declare war on a family that spent 2.5 decades learning how to fight and win. Marcus Jr. looked between his father and Amara, recognizing something in the Admiral's tone that he had never heard before. A cold, calculating fury that promised systematic destruction of whatever forces had harmed his wife. "What do you need from me?" the young midshipman asked. "I need you to channel that anger into strategic thinking. This isn't about revenge, it's about justice. And justice requires patience, precision, and overwhelming force applied at exactly the right moment." As medical staff monitored Amara's condition throughout the evening, Marcus Mitchell began the mental process of transforming from naval commander into justice-seeking husband. The tactical mind that had revolutionized fleet operations now focused on a different kind of enemy: institutional corruption and racist abuse of power. By morning, he would begin the campaign that would either restore his family's faith in American justice or prove that the system was too corrupt to deserve the loyalty he had spent his career defending. The Mitchell family home in Norfolk's historic Ghent district had been transformed overnight into something resembling a military command center. The Admiral's study, normally lined with naval history books and family photographs, now featured secure communication equipment, multiple computer screens, and classified briefing materials that Captain Chen had requisitioned through proper channels. Master Chief Petty Officer James Washington arrived at 0600, his 30 years of service evident in the way he carried himself despite officially being on leave. At 55, he had served as Marcus's mentor and moral compass through his younger man's rise through the ranks, and his presence signaled the seriousness with which the Naval Command viewed the assault on one of their own. "Admiral," Washington said, settling his imposing frame into the chair across from Marcus's desk. "I've seen a lot of injustice in my time, both in and out of uniform. But what happened to Dr. Mitchell represents something that goes beyond individual prejudice. This was systemic. Someone put that officer in position knowing his history." Lieutenant Colonel David Park entered the room carrying 2 briefcases of legal materials, his Korean-American features set in the determined expression that had made him one of the Navy's most respected JAG officers. His expertise in civil rights law had been honed through personal experience with discrimination and professional dedication to ensuring military justice lived up to its highest ideals.
"Sir, I've conducted preliminary research on the legal frameworks surrounding this incident," Park reported, opening his briefcase to reveal meticulously organized files. "The civil rights violations are clear and actionable under federal law, but there are jurisdictional complexities that suggest this was designed to exploit gaps between military and civilian oversight." Marcus studied the organizational chart that Chen had constructed on the wall, showing the relationships between courthouse security, local law enforcement, and judicial administration. Red lines connected individuals, revealing a network that protected problem officers rather than the public they were supposed to serve. "Tell me about Kozlov's military record," Marcus ordered. Park consulted his files. Dishonorably discharged from military police in 2021, 3 separate incidents of excessive force against minorities, plus evidence of racial harassment that command couldn't ignore. The discharge should have disqualified him from any law enforcement or security position. But he's working courthouse security, Washington observed grimly. Someone pulled strings to get him that job despite his record. Chen highlighted connections on the chart. Sheriff William Crawford has a history of placing discharged military personnel in civilian positions without proper background reviews. Judge Harold Brennan has consistently ruled in favor of law enforcement in misconduct cases. There's a financial connection. Crawford's office receives federal grants that Brennan's rulings help maintain. The picture emerging on the wall showed systematic corruption designed to shield abusive officers from consequences while maintaining plausible deniability for the officials who protected them. "What about witnesses?" Marcus asked. "Rebecca Santos, courthouse clerk, recorded the entire incident on her phone," Chen reported. "But she's being pressured to delete the recording and change her statement to support Kozlov's version of events." Marcus stood and walked to the window overlooking the Elizabeth River, where naval vessels moved with purposeful precision toward their assignments. His wife lay in a hospital bed because a racist had been deliberately placed in a position to harm minorities, protected by a network that valued officer solidarity over civilian rights. "Master Chief," he said without turning around, "in your experience, what happens when someone attacks a military family?" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Washington's weathered face showed a grim smile. "They learn why that was a mistake, sir." Across town, Judge Harold Brennan sat in his chambers reviewing the preliminary reports about the courthouse incident with growing concern. At 59, he had built his judicial career on maintaining favorable relationships with law enforcement, while carefully avoiding the kind of scrutiny that came with high-profile civil rights cases. His appointment had been secured through political connections that expected continued cooperation with police interests. Sheriff Crawford's call had been brief but clear. The Mitchell incident needed to be handled quietly, with minimal publicity and no federal intervention. The system that had protected dozens of problem officers over the years required the same protection now. "Your Honor, there's a call from the Attorney General's office. They're asking about federal jurisdiction in the Mitchell case." Brennan felt his stomach tighten. Federal attention was exactly what they couldn't afford, especially with the financial arrangements that had funded his campaigns coming under increased scrutiny from government ethics investigators. Meanwhile, Rebecca Santos sat in her small apartment staring at her phone and the recording that showed the truth about what had happened to Dr. Mitchell. The courthouse administrator had been clear. Delete the video, sign a statement supporting Kozlov's version of events, and keep her job. Refuse and face termination for violating security protocols by recording in a federal facility. At 26, she had dreamed of becoming a prosecutor who would fight for justice against exactly the kind of institutional corruption she was now being asked to support. Her law school debt totaled over $150,000, and losing this job would make passing the bar exam financially impossible. But every time she considered deleting the video, she remembered Dr. Mitchell's dignified conduct under harassment and the sound of her head hitting the marble floor. Some moral lines, once crossed, could never be uncrossed. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Miss Santos, this is Captain Chen from Admiral Mitchell's staff. We know you recorded the incident. Would you be willing to speak with us? Your courage could help ensure justice for Dr. Mitchell and prevent this from happening to others." Rebecca stared at the message for several minutes before typing her response. "Yes. Where do you want to meet?"
Back at the Mitchell Command Center, Marcus concluded his first day of intelligence gathering with a clear understanding of what they faced.
This wasn't just about one racist officer. It was about a system designed to protect such officers while providing institutional cover for their crimes. "Gentlemen," he addressed his assembled team, "we're not dealing with individual bad actors. We're confronting a network that has systematically corrupted civilian law enforcement oversight. That means we need to approach this as we would any strategic campaign against an entrenched enemy." Washington nodded approvingly. "What's our objective, Admiral?" Marcus looked at the organizational chart with its red lines connecting corrupt officials, then at the photographs of his wife in the hospital that Chen had placed on his desk as motivation. "Complete dismantlement of the network that enabled the assault on my wife," he said with quiet intensity. "Not just punishment for individuals, but systematic reform that prevents this from happening to other families. We're going to use every resource, every connection, and every strategic advantage our service has given us to ensure that justice isn't just served, it's institutionalized." The war room fell silent as the implications of that commitment settled over the assembled military personnel. They were about to wage a campaign that would test everything they had learned about strategy, logistics, and leadership against an enemy that controlled significant portions of the civilian legal system. But they had one advantage the corrupt network hadn't anticipated. They had just declared war on a family that had spent decades learning how to identify weaknesses, exploit them systematically, and achieve victory through superior planning and execution. The battle for justice was about to begin. Rebecca Santos met Captain Chen at a small coffee shop in Norfolk's Neon District, far from the courthouse and its network of surveillance that might compromise their conversation. The young courthouse clerk carried herself with the nervous determination of someone who had decided that moral courage mattered more than job security, but who hadn't yet fully calculated the personal cost of that choice. "Ms. Santos," Chen said, extending her hand with military precision, "Admiral Mitchell asked me to thank you for your willingness to speak with us. We understand the risk you're taking." Rebecca's phone sat on the table between them, its screen displaying the paused video that showed Derek Kozlov's unprovoked assault on Dr. Mitchell. The footage was damning, clearly capturing the racial harassment, the escalating aggression, and the taser attack that had left a respected pediatrician unconscious on courthouse marble. "They told me to delete it," Rebecca said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of sleepless nights spent wrestling with her conscience. "The courthouse administrator said I violated security protocols by recording in a federal facility. They offered me a promotion to stay quiet, and when I hesitated, they threatened termination." Chen studied the young woman's face, recognizing the moral fortitude that separated true patriots from those who merely wore uniforms or carried badges. "What made you decide to come forward?" "Dr. Mitchell volunteers at community health fairs. I've seen her treating undocumented children for free, never asking questions, just helping kids who needed medical care. When I watched her maintain her dignity even while being humiliated and assaulted, I realized that staying silent would make me complicit in a system that rewards cruelty and punishes compassion." Back at the Mitchell Command Center, Lieutenant Colonel Park was assembling a financial profile that revealed the systematic corruption underlying the courthouse incident. Using his access to federal databases and his expertise in following money trails through complex legal structures, he had uncovered connections that transformed isolated incidents into evidence of conspiracy. "Admiral, the financial pattern showed deliberate coordination," Park reported, spreading documents across the conference table. "Judge Brennan's family trust has received over $3 million in consulting fees from law enforcement unions over the past 8 years. Sheriff Crawford's office gets federal grants that require favorable judicial rulings to maintain funding levels. Master Chief Washington studied the financial flowcharts with the experienced eye of someone who had seen corruption in various forms throughout his military career. This isn't coincidence, it's a business model.
They're monetizing the protection of problem officers. Marcus examined the evidence with strategic focus, recognizing patterns that extended beyond individual corruption into systematic institutional capture. What about Kozlov specifically? How did he get the courthouse position? Crawford personally recommended him despite the dishonorable discharge, he reported from his investigation files. The recommendation letter cited Kozlov's military police experience while omitting the misconduct that led to his dismissal. The courthouse security supervisor who approved the hire received a promotion 3 weeks later. The picture emerging from their investigation showed a network designed to protect officers like Kozlov while maintaining plausible deniability for the officials who enabled their continued abuse of civilians. Each component of the system provided cover for the others, creating institutional protection that individual complaints couldn't penetrate.
Across town, Commissioner Angela Torres sat in her office, reviewing preliminary reports about the Mitchell incident with growing alarm. At 52, she had accepted the appointment to head courthouse administration with genuine intentions of reforming a system she knew harbored problems. Her background as a prosecutor had shown her how institutional corruption could pervert justice, and she had hoped to use her position to implement meaningful changes. But the political realities of her appointment were becoming clear as Sheriff Crawford and Judge Brennan pressured her to contain the Mitchell situation before it attracted unwanted federal attention. The phone calls had been carefully worded, discussions of budget considerations and staffing priorities that carried unmistakable threats about her continued employment. "Commissioner," her deputy knocked on the door, "there's been a development. Rebecca Santos has retained an attorney and is refusing to sign the revised statement about the Mitchell incident." Torres felt her stomach tighten. The revised statement would support Kozlov's claim that Dr. Mitchell had behaved aggressively and posed a security threat, directly contradicting the video evidence that Torres had reviewed in confidence. Signing such a statement would end Rebecca's legal career before it began, but refusing could trigger retaliation that would accomplish the same goal through different means. "Schedule a meeting with Miss Santos," Torres instructed. "I need to speak with her personally." Meanwhile, Marcus Mitchell was receiving updates from contacts throughout the military intelligence community who had quietly begun investigating the civilian officials involved in his wife's assault. The resources available to a Rear Admiral with an exemplary service record included access to federal databases, surveillance capabilities, and analysis expertise that the corrupt network had never anticipated facing. "Sir, we've identified 12 other incidents involving officers transferred through Crawford's placement program," reported Chief Petty Officer Williams, an intelligence specialist who had volunteered for the investigation. "Pattern analysis shows systematic targeting of minorities, particularly in venues where complaints would be difficult to substantiate." The systematic nature of the abuse network was becoming undeniable. Crawford's office wasn't just protecting individual problem officers, it was operating a placement service that allowed racist and violent officers to continue harming civilians while avoiding accountability through jurisdictional complications and institutional protection. Dr. Mitchell, recovering at home under cardiac monitoring, reviewed the evidence her husband's team had assembled with the analytical mind that had made her a respected physician. Despite her physical vulnerability, her voice carried moral authority that commanded attention when she spoke. "Marcus," she said, sitting up in their living room despite the doctor's orders to rest, "this isn't just about what happened to me. Look at these patterns. They've been systematically placing abusive officers in positions where they can harm the most vulnerable people: children, elderly citizens, anyone who can't fight back effectively." Marcus studied his wife's face, noting the determination that had drawn him to her 23 years ago when they met in medical school. Her assault was personal, but the network that enabled it represented a threat to every family that couldn't command the resources he was bringing to bear on this investigation. "What do you recommend?"
he asked, recognizing that her perspective as both victim and healer provided crucial insight into their strategic objectives. "Document everything," she replied with quiet intensity. "Make sure this evidence reaches people who can act on it at the federal level. And protect Rebecca Santos. She's risking everything to ensure the truth comes out." That afternoon, Rebecca Santos sat across from Commissioner Torres in the courthouse administrative offices, acutely aware that her career and financial future hung on the conversation's outcome. Torres studied the young woman's file, noting her law school achievements and her supervisory evaluations that consistently praised her integrity and attention to detail. "Rebecca," Torres began carefully, "I understand you're in a difficult position. The courthouse administration values employees who show judgment and discretion in sensitive situations." The coded language was unmistakable. "Cooperate with the cover-up and receive protection and advancement, or maintain your integrity and face institutional retaliation." Rebecca had prepared for this moment during sleepless nights of wrestling with her conscience and her student loan payments. "Commissioner, I recorded what I witnessed because I recognized injustice when I saw it. Dr. Mitchell was treated with disrespect and violence because of her race, and Officer Kozlov's conduct violated every standard of professional behavior we claim to uphold." Torres leaned forward, recognizing moral courage that reminded her of her own early prosecutorial career before political considerations began influencing her decisions. "The video recording violates security protocols. That's grounds for termination." "Then terminate me," she said quietly. "But I won't sign a false statement, and I won't delete evidence of a civil rights violation." The young woman's courage presented Torres with her own defining moment. She could protect her position by sacrificing Rebecca to the network that had placed her in office, or she could risk her career by supporting someone who embodied the principles she claimed to serve. By evening, Marcus Mitchell had reached a crucial decision about expanding the scope of his investigation. The evidence gathered by his team showed corruption that extended beyond local officials into federal oversight agencies that had ignored patterns of abuse for years. "Captain Chen," he instructed, "contact our Pentagon liaison. It's time to brief federal authorities on what we've discovered. This network has been operating with impunity because they thought no one had the resources to investigate them systematically." Chen nodded, understanding the implications. "Sir, bringing in federal oversight will escalate their retaliation efforts. They'll try to discredit you through military channels." "Let them try," Marcus replied grimly. "I've spent 26 years building a reputation based on honor and results. They've spent years building a reputation based on protecting racist thugs. We'll see which foundation proves more solid under scrutiny." As the Mitchell family prepared for the next phase of their campaign for justice, they couldn't yet anticipate how desperately the corruption network would fight to protect itself, or how far its members would go to destroy anyone who threatened their profitable arrangement of institutional protection for abusive officers. The Pentagon Civil Rights Division occupied offices that embodied the military's commitment to justice through order and systematic process. Marcus Mitchell sat across from FBI Assistant Director Catherine Walsh, whose Civil Rights Division had developed expertise in prosecuting institutional corruption that crossed jurisdictional boundaries. Behind him, Lieutenant Colonel Park arranged documentation that transformed individual incidents into evidence of conspiracy. "Admiral," Walsh said, reviewing the initial briefing materials, "what you've uncovered suggests systematic civil rights violations that require federal intervention. The pattern of evidence indicates conspiracy to deprive citizens of constitutional rights under color of law." Marcus had chosen his approach carefully, presenting the investigation as a matter of national security rather than personal vendetta. Officers who abused civilians while hiding behind institutional protection represented the same threat to democratic institutions as foreign enemies who attacked American values through violence. "Director Walsh, the evidence shows a network that has been operating for at least 8 years. Marcus replied, his voice carrying the authority of command briefings that had shaped military policy. They've systematically placed officers with documented histories of racial violence in civilian positions where they can continue harming citizens without military oversight. Park opened his briefcase to reveal financial records that showed the financial incentives driving the corruption network. Ma'am, the financial arrangements create profit margins that encourage continued placement of problem officers. Sheriff Crawford's office receives federal grants tied to courthouse security effectiveness, while Judge Brennan's family trust benefits from law enforcement union consulting contracts. Walsh studied the documentation with the experienced eye of someone who had prosecuted organized crime networks that used legitimate institutions to shield criminal activity. The sophistication of the arrangement suggested coordination that went beyond opportunistic corruption into systematic criminal enterprise. "What about witnesses?" Walsh asked, recognizing that financial evidence alone might not be sufficient for prosecuting all network members. "Rebecca Santos, courthouse clerk, has video documentation of the assault on my wife. Commissioner Torres has been pressured to suppress evidence but may be willing to cooperate with federal investigators. We've identified 12 additional victims who were targeted by officers placed through Crawford's network." The meeting concluded with Walsh authorizing a federal civil rights investigation that would bring FBI resources to bear on the corruption network. Marcus understood that federal intervention represented both opportunity and risk. It would provide investigative capabilities beyond his military resources, but it would also trigger desperate retaliation from officials who had operated with impunity for years. Dr. Mitchell had insisted on providing testimony despite her ongoing cardiac recovery, recognizing that her voice as both victim and respected community member could provide moral authority that statistical evidence couldn't match. The FBI field office in Norfolk had been configured to accommodate her medical needs, with cardiac monitoring equipment and medical personnel standing by during her interview. "Agent Morrison," she began, her voice carrying the quiet strength that had sustained her through 2 decades of treating vulnerable children. "What happened to me represents systematic failure of institutions that should protect all citizens equally. But my assault was captured on video, and my husband has resources to seek justice. How many other victims never get that opportunity?" Agent Morrison, a 20-year veteran of civil rights investigations, recognized the moral clarity that separated cases seeking justice from those seeking revenge. Dr. Mitchell's testimony focused not on personal grievances, but on institutional failures that enabled continued victimization of those without resources to fight back. "Dr. Mitchell, can you describe Officer Kozlov's behavior during the security screening?" "He targeted me from the moment I entered the line. His tone and body language toward me differed markedly from his treatment of white court visitors. When I requested supervisory intervention, a reasonable response to inappropriate treatment, he escalated to physical force without justification. Meanwhile, Judge Brennan was discovering that federal investigation represented threats that his political connections couldn't neutralize. The FBI's Financial Crimes Unit had begun examining
His family trust's income sources, while his judicial immunity provided no protection against questions about non-judicial activities that generated personal profit. Sheriff Crawford's response to federal scrutiny revealed the desperation of someone whose entire career had been built on relationships that couldn't survive transparent examination. His calls to political contact sought protection that was no longer available, as federal investigators followed money trails that implicated multiple jurisdictions. "Agent Parker, we have full cooperation with any legitimate investigation," Crawford told the FBI team conducting interviews at his office. "But I won't allow fishing expeditions that undermine public confidence in law enforcement." The bravado couldn't mask the underlying panic as federal agents requested personnel files that would document Crawford's placement of discharged military officers in civilian positions. Each file represented potential evidence of conspiracy to deprive citizens of civil rights, carrying penalties that could destroy careers and result in federal prison sentences.
Marcus Jr. had requested permission to speak publicly about his stepmother's assault, recognizing that his status as a Naval Academy midshipman could provide credibility to media coverage that might otherwise be dismissed as political advocacy. His father had initially resisted, understanding that publicity could complicate ongoing investigations, but Dr. Mitchell had convinced him that moral leadership required public accountability. "My stepmother dedicated her career to helping children who couldn't afford private medical care," Marcus Jr. told the Norfolk Virginian pilot reporter. "She was assaulted because someone decided her dignity was worth less than his momentary sense of power. This isn't just about one family, it's about whether institutions serve justice or protect those who pervert it." The interview, published alongside Rebecca's video footage, transformed local controversy into national conversation about institutional racism and accountability. Civil rights organizations across the country began monitoring the case as a test of whether federal civil rights enforcement could penetrate local corruption networks that had operated with impunity. Commissioner Torres faced the defining decision of her career as federal investigators requested her cooperation in documenting the pressure she had received to suppress evidence and silence witnesses. Her appointment to head courthouse administration had come through political relationships that expected continued loyalty. But federal investigation meant those relationships could no longer provide protection if she had violated civil rights laws. "Agent Walsh," Torres said during her interview, "I need you to understand the environment I've been working in. Sheriff Crawford and Judge Brennan made it clear that my continued employment depended on containing the Mitchell situation. When Rebecca Santos refused to sign a false statement, I was instructed to terminate her employment for security violations." The admission provided federal investigators with direct evidence of conspiracy to obstruct justice and intimidate witnesses, crimes that carried significant federal penalties and would strengthen their case against the corruption network's leadership. As media attention intensified, Dr. Mitchell found herself becoming a reluctant symbol of resistance against institutional racism. Interview requests flooded in from national news organizations seeking to understand how a respected pediatrician's routine courthouse visit had exposed systematic corruption in the justice system. "I never sought to become a public figure," she told CNN's civil rights correspondent. "But when injustice happens to someone with resources and connections, we have a responsibility to ensure our experience leads to changes that protect those without such advantages." The national attention was attracting support from unexpected sources, including retired military officers who recognized the threat that civilian institutional corruption posed to the democratic values they had sworn to defend. A group of former Pentagon officials issued a statement supporting federal investigation and praising Admiral Mitchell's strategic approach to seeking systematic reform rather than personal revenge. By the end of the week, the corruption network that had protected Derek Kozlov and dozens of other problem officers faced federal investigation with resources and legal authority they had never anticipated confronting. But their response would prove that desperate institutions could be even more dangerous than desperate individuals when their power was threatened. The retaliation began with surgical precision designed to destroy careers and intimidate witnesses without leaving fingerprints that could be traced back to the corruption network. Rebecca Santos arrived at her courthouse office Monday morning to find a termination letter citing security violations, insubordination, and misuse of recording equipment, charges that would disqualify her from any future legal employment. "Ms. Santos," the courthouse administrator said with bureaucratic coldness, "your employment is terminated effective immediately. Security will escort you out of the building, and any attempt to return will result in trespassing charges." Rebecca had anticipated this retaliation, but the reality of losing her income while carrying $150,000 in student loans created panic that threatened to override her moral convictions. The legal career she had sacrificed everything to achieve was being destroyed by her refusal to participate in covering up a civil rights violation. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Courthouse jobs aren't the only positions that require background checks. Troublemakers find it hard to get hired anywhere." Meanwhile, Dr. Mitchell discovered that her medical practice was facing systematic harassment designed to destroy her ability to serve the community she had dedicated her career to helping. Anonymous complaints about her medical license flooded the state medical board, each requiring investigation that would consume time and resources she needed for patient care.
Threatening phone calls began arriving at her clinic, some containing explicit racial slurs and promises of violence if she continued cooperating with federal investigators. Her staff, predominantly young nurses and medical assistants, were visibly shaken by the escalating intimidation tactics. Dr. Mitchell, her office manager, approached her with visible concern. 3 more staff members have asked about finding other positions. They're scared about working here while these threats continue. The attack on her medical practice represented more than personal retaliation. It threatened healthcare access for hundreds of low-income children who depended on her clinic for treatment they couldn't afford elsewhere. The corruption network was demonstrating that challenging their authority would result in harm to the vulnerable communities that Dr. Mitchell served. Sheriff Crawford had escalated his retaliation efforts by contacting his Pentagon connections, attempting to undermine Admiral Mitchell through military channels that might be sympathetic to law enforcement perspectives. His strategy involved portraying the Admiral as someone who was abusing his military position for personal vendettas that threatened cooperative relationships between military and civilian law enforcement. "General Harrison," Crawford said during a carefully arranged phone call with a retired Army general who had influence in Pentagon circles, "Admiral Mitchell is using classified military resources to conduct personal investigations. He's creating precedents that could undermine civilian law enforcement authority and military-police cooperation." The allegation was crafted to exploit military concerns about maintaining appropriate boundaries between military and civilian jurisdictions. Crawford hoped that institutional loyalty would override individual support for the Admiral's quest for justice, particularly if senior military officials believed that precedent could complicate future operations requiring civilian law enforcement cooperation. Admiral Mitchell received notification of the complaint through official military channels, recognizing immediately that the corruption network was attempting to neutralize his investigation by forcing him to defend his own conduct rather than exposing theirs. The timing was calculated to coincide with federal investigations' expansion, potentially limiting his ability to provide continued support for FBI efforts. Captain Chen briefed him on the implications during their morning strategy session. "Sir, they're trying to force you into a defensive posture by questioning your use of military resources for civilian investigations. Pentagon leadership will need to review your conduct to avoid appearance of impropriety." Marcus studied the complaint with the analytical mind that had made him successful in navigating complex military bureaucracies. "They're assuming that institutional pressure will force me to back down to protect my career. They don't understand that some things matter more than career advancement." The threats escalated when Commissioner Torres discovered surveillance teams monitoring her home and following her children to school. The message was clear. Cooperation with federal investigators would result in retaliation against her family members who had no involvement in the courthouse corruption. Her teenage daughter called her from school in tears. "Mom, there's a man in a car outside the school taking pictures of students. The teachers called police, but he left before they arrived." Torres recognized professional intimidation techniques designed to terrorize families into silence without providing evidence that could support criminal charges. The surveillance was legal, but its purpose was unmistakably threatening. Comply with the cover-up or watch your children live in fear. Lieutenant Colonel Park faced his own retaliation as military legal colleagues questioned his involvement in what some characterized as a personal vendetta that exceeded appropriate military legal assistance. Anonymous complaints about his conduct reached JAG Command, alleging that he was misusing his position to support civilian litigation against law enforcement officers. Colonel Park, his commanding officer, called him for an official discussion. "There are concerns about your involvement in Admiral Mitchell's civilian legal activities. Military legal officers are expected to maintain appropriate boundaries with civilian law enforcement."
Park had anticipated this pressure, understanding that the corruption network would attempt to isolate Admiral Mitchell by forcing his military supporters to withdraw from the investigation. His response reflected both legal expertise and moral conviction that military justice required confronting civilian corruption that victimized military families. "Sir, Dr. Mitchell is the wife of a serving admiral who was assaulted while engaged in lawful activities in a federal courthouse. Military legal assistance to families facing civil rights violations falls within established precedents for supporting military personnel." The most dangerous escalation came when anonymous sources began leaking distorted information about the Mitchell family to media outlets sympathetic to law enforcement perspectives. The leaked materials portrayed Admiral Mitchell as an angry husband who was abusing his military position to seek revenge against dedicated law enforcement officers, while characterizing Dr. Mitchell as someone who had provoked the courthouse incident through aggressive behavior. Conservative media personalities began broadcasting narratives that transformed the victim into the aggressor while portraying Derek Kozlov as a dedicated security officer who had made a split-second decision to protect public safety.
Portions of Dr. Mitchell's medical records that violated patient privacy laws but provided fodder for character assassination efforts. "Admiral," Master Chief Washington observed grimly, "they're trying to win in the court of public opinion what they can't win in the court of law. This is information warfare designed to undermine support for your family and the federal investigation." Marcus recognized the escalation as confirmation that their investigation was threatening the corruption network's survival. Desperate institutions, like desperate individuals, became most dangerous when their existence was threatened. But the personal attacks on his wife and the intimidation of witnesses like Rebecca Santos had crossed lines that transformed his strategic campaign into something more personal. "Master Chief," he said, his voice carrying the cold determination that had made him effective in military operations. "They've just made a crucial tactical error. They've escalated this beyond institutional conflict into personal warfare against my family. That changes the rules of engagement." The retaliation campaign was designed to force the Mitchell family and their allies to abandon their quest for justice rather than continue facing systematic harassment and character assassination. But the corruption network had underestimated the strategic patience and institutional resources that Admiral Mitchell could bring to bear in defending his family while continuing to pursue the systematic destruction of those who had declared war on them. As the intimidation tactics intensified, Marcus Mitchell prepared for the next phase of his campaign, one that would demonstrate to the corruption network that attacking a military family brought consequences they were unprepared to handle. Admiral Mitchell stood before a secure video conference connecting Norfolk, Washington, D.C., and Atlanta, addressing an unprecedented coalition of federal prosecutors, civil rights organizations, and military legal experts who had assembled to coordinate the systematic dismantlement of the corruption network. The strategic mind that had revolutionized naval tactical doctrine now focused on institutional warfare against civilian targets who had made the fatal error of attacking a military family. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus began, his voice carrying the authority of command briefings that had shaped Pentagon policy. "We are not seeking vengeance against individuals. We are implementing systematic reform of institutions that have been captured by criminal networks operating under color of law." Assistant Attorney General Patricia Hayes nodded from her Washington office. "Admiral, the Justice Department is prepared to provide full federal support for this operation. The evidence your team has assembled justifies RICO charges against the entire network, treating their activities as organized criminal enterprise." Lieutenant Colonel Park unveiled the comprehensive legal strategy he had developed utilizing his expertise in both military and civilian law to create multi-jurisdictional prosecutions that would prevent the defendants from exploiting gaps between different legal systems. His approach reflected strategic thinking that treated each legal filing as a tactical maneuver in a larger campaign.
We're filing simultaneous federal civil rights lawsuits, state criminal charges, and professional misconduct complaints, Park explained, his presentation displaying a timeline that showed coordinated legal actions across multiple jurisdictions. Each case reinforces the others while preventing the defendants from consolidating their defense strategies. Captain Chen had orchestrated a media strategy that leveraged the Mitchell family's moral authority while maintaining focus on systemic issues rather than personal grievances. Her background in military public affairs provided expertise in managing complex narratives that required sustained public attention without sensationalism. Sir, we have commitments from major news organizations to cover the systematic aspects of this corruption, rather than treating it as an isolated incident. Dr. Mitchell's status as a pediatrician serving vulnerable children provides moral clarity that transcends political divisions. The coordination extended beyond legal and media strategies to include protection for witnesses who had risked their careers to provide evidence against the corruption network. Master Chief Washington had arranged discreet security monitoring for Rebecca Santos, Commissioner Torres, and other witnesses who faced continued intimidation. Admiral, Washington observed, protecting these witnesses isn't just about this case, it's about establishing precedent that people who speak truth to power receive institutional support rather than institutional retaliation. Dr. Mitchell, participating via video link from their home where she continued cardiac recovery, provided the moral compass that kept the campaign focused on justice rather than revenge. Her perspective as both victim and healer offered strategic insights that complemented her husband's military expertise. Marcus, we need to ensure that whatever justice we achieve here creates lasting change. The children I treat can't fight these battles for themselves. We have an obligation to make the system work for them. The counterattack began with Lieutenant Colonel Park filing comprehensive federal lawsuits that named not only the individual defendants, but also the institutions that had enabled their criminal behavior. The legal documents, totaling over 400 pages, detailed how financial incentives had created systematic corruption that violated civil rights laws, RICO statutes, and constitutional protections.
Your Honor, Park argued before Federal Judge Maria Santos, the defendants operated a criminal enterprise that systematically deprived citizens of civil rights while generating profit through federal grants and private consulting arrangements. This case requires institutional remedies, not just individual punishment. Media coverage, coordinated through Chen's strategy, began exposing the full scope of the corruption network to national audiences. The carefully documented evidence provided journalists with compelling narratives that showed how local corruption had federal implications, transforming a regional story into a national conversation about institutional accountability. NBC's investigative team provided exclusive access to financial records and witness testimony, produced a documentary series titled The Blue Shield: How Police Corruption Captured the Courts. The series demonstrated how the Norfolk network represented a model that existed in jurisdictions across the country, making the Mitchell case a catalyst for national reform efforts. Additional victims began coming forward as media coverage encouraged people who had previously remained silent about their experiences with the corruption network. The FBI established a special hotline for reporting similar incidents, receiving over 200 calls in the first week after the documentary series aired. Agent Morrison, reported the field supervisor, "We're identifying patterns that suggest this model of corruption exists in at least 12 other federal districts. The Norfolk case may be the tip of an iceberg that requires nationwide investigation." Meanwhile, Sheriff Crawford's attempts to maintain control of his network were failing as federal surveillance documented his efforts to destroy evidence and intimidate witnesses. The man who had protected problem officers for over a decade was discovering that federal investigators possessed resources and authorities that local political connections couldn't neutralize. Judge Brennan's judicial immunity provided no protection against questions about his non-judicial activities that had generated millions in consulting income. Federal tax investigators were examining whether the payments represented legitimate consulting fees or bribes disguised as professional services. His family trust's financial records revealed patterns that suggested systematic quid pro quo arrangements with law enforcement organizations. Master Chief Washington provided Admiral Mitchell with the emotional support and strategic counsel that prevented the extended campaign from consuming his family relationships. His 30 years of leadership experience included witnessing both successful and failed attempts to reform corrupt institutions, provided perspective that kept the Admiral focused on long-term objectives rather than short-term victories. "Admiral," Washington observed, "this campaign is testing everything we learned about leadership, strategy, and institutional change. The enemy is fighting desperately because they understand that losing means not just individual punishment, but systematic transformation that ends their way of life." Marcus nodded, understanding that the corruption network's desperation would make them increasingly dangerous as federal prosecution appeared inevitable. But his strategic mind was already 3 moves ahead, anticipating their likely responses and preparing countermeasures that would ensure justice prevailed regardless of their final attempts to escape accountability. The surveillance footage was crystal clear. Sheriff William Bull Crawford entering his office at 2:30 a.m., systematically feeding documents into an industrial shredder while believing himself unobserved. Federal agents had been monitoring the sheriff's office for 2 weeks, anticipating exactly this kind of evidence destruction as prosecutorial pressure mounted. "Agent Parker, we have Crawford on video destroying what appears to be personnel files," reported the surveillance team leader. "He's been in there for 47 minutes, shredding documents and deleting computer files." Crawford's desperation had led him to commit federal obstruction of justice while under active investigation, providing prosecutors with additional charges that carried mandatory prison sentences. The man who had spent 35 years in law enforcement was demonstrating the same poor judgment that had led him to place racist officers in civilian positions without proper background reviews. Judge Harold Brennan sat in his attorney's office, his patrician composure finally cracking under the weight of financial evidence that federal investigators had assembled against him. The consulting fees that had funded his family's lifestyle for nearly a decade were being systematically documented as bribes paid in exchange for favorable rulings in police misconduct cases. "Your Honor," his attorney said carefully, "the prosecution is offering immunity in exchange for complete cooperation and testimony against other network members. Given the strength of their financial evidence, this may be our best option." Brennan's fall from judicial prominence to potential federal defendant represented the collapse of institutional protection that had enabled the corruption network's operations. His attempt to negotiate immunity would require admitting to years of systematic corruption while providing testimony that would implicate officials throughout the regional justice system. Commissioner Angela Torres sat before the federal grand jury, her testimony providing prosecutors with detailed evidence of the systematic pressure she had received to suppress evidence and intimidate witnesses. Her decision to cooperate fully with federal investigators was providing crucial insider testimony that corroborated the financial evidence and witness statements. "Members of the grand jury," Torres testified, "I was explicitly instructed that my continued employment depended on ensuring the Mitchell incident didn't attract federal attention. When Rebecca Santos refused to sign a false statement supporting Officer Kozlov's version of events, I was ordered to terminate her employment and ensure she couldn't find work elsewhere." Derek Kozlov's defense strategy was collapsing as his attorneys attempted to claim he had been following orders from supervisors who had instructed him to be particularly vigilant about courthouse security. The defense required portraying Dr. Mitchell as someone who had posed a genuine security threat, directly contradicting video evidence that showed his unprovoked racial harassment and assault. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Kozlov's attorney argued desperately, "my client was following established security protocols when dealing with someone who was behaving suspiciously and refused to comply with reasonable requests.
The argument fell apart when prosecutors presented Rebecca Santos's video footage alongside testimony from other courthouse witnesses who described Kozlov's systematic targeting of minority court visitors. His pattern of racist behavior, documented through military records and witness testimony, demolished any claim that the assault on Dr. Mitchell had been motivated by legitimate security concerns rather than racial animus. Lieutenant Colonel Park's systematic legal strategy was achieving its intended effect of preventing the defendants from coordinating their defense or exploiting jurisdictional complications. Each defendant faced charges in multiple courts simultaneously, forcing them to divide their resources while preventing any single corrupt official from protecting others through favorable rulings or administrative interference. Your Honor, Park argued in federal court, the defendants operated as a criminal enterprise that systematically violated citizens' civil rights while generating profit through corruption of judicial and law enforcement institutions. The evidence shows conspiracy, racketeering, and systematic deprivation of constitutional rights under color of law. Federal grand jury indictments were returned against 11 individuals, including Sheriff Crawford, Judge Brennan, Derek Kozlov, and several courthouse administrators who had participated in the cover-up efforts. The charges included civil rights violations, conspiracy, racketeering, obstruction of justice, and tax evasion related to bribes disguised as consulting fees. Dr. Mitchell's testimony before a congressional hearing on institutional racism in the justice system provided national visibility for the systemic reforms that her family's ordeal had inspired. Her perspective as both victim and medical professional gave her unique authority to speak about how corruption affected the most vulnerable communities. Members of Congress, Dr. Mitchell testified, "What happened to me was not an isolated incident, but a symptom of systemic institutional failures that enable continued victimization of those without resources to fight back. The children I treat depend on institutions that are supposed to protect them. When those institutions are captured by corrupt networks, the most vulnerable suffer most."
As federal prosecution moved towards sentencing, the Mitchell family could see that their personal tragedy was being transformed into lasting institutional change that would protect countless other families from the kind of systematic injustice they had confronted and overcome through strategic action and moral courage. The federal courthouse in Norfolk was packed beyond capacity as Judge Maria Santos prepared to hand down sentences in United States v. Crawford et al., the most comprehensive prosecution of institutional corruption in the district's history. Admiral Mitchell sat with his wife and son in the front row, witnessing the conclusion of a campaign that had transformed personal tragedy into systematic reform. Derek Kozlov stood before the bench first, his courthouse security uniform replaced by an orange jumpsuit that marked his transition from someone who abused authority to someone subject to federal justice. The man who had tasered Dr. Mitchell because he enjoyed exercising power over minorities now faced the consequences of his actions. "Mr. Kozlov," Judge Santos began, her voice carrying the weight of judicial authority backed by constitutional principles. "You committed a federal civil rights violation when you assaulted Dr. Mitchell without justification. Your actions were motivated by racial animus and enabled by a corrupt network that protected officers like you from accountability. This court sentences you to 8 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release." The sentence reflected not just the assault on Dr. Mitchell, but the pattern of racist behavior that federal investigators had documented throughout Kozlov's career in both military and civilian law enforcement. His placement in civilian security, despite his dishonorable discharge, had been facilitated by the very corruption network that was now being systematically dismantled. Sheriff William Crawford received a 7-year sentence for conspiracy to violate civil rights, obstruction of justice, and racketeering.
The man who had spent decades protecting problem officers while profiting from federal grants tied to courthouse security had become the subject of federal prosecution that stripped him of his pension and law enforcement authority. Sheriff Crawford, Judge Santos continued, your systematic placement of officers with documented histories of racist violence in civilian positions created a criminal enterprise that harmed countless citizens. You corrupted institutions that citizens depend on for protection and justice. Judge Harold Brennan's fall from judicial office to federal defendant concluded with a 6-year sentence that reflected his central role in providing legal protection for the corruption network through favorable rulings in police misconduct cases. His judicial immunity had provided no protection against prosecution for non-judicial activities that violated bribery and tax evasion laws. The sentences were accompanied by institutional reforms that extended far beyond individual punishment to systematic changes in how courthouse security, judicial oversight, and law enforcement accountability operated throughout the federal system. The Mitchell Protocols became standard nationwide, establishing uniform procedures that prevented discriminatory treatment of court visitors regardless of race or appearance. Commissioner Angela Torres, whose cooperation with federal investigators had been crucial to securing convictions, was appointed to head a new federal oversight committee for courthouse security operations. Her redemption from someone pressured to participate in corruption to someone leading reform efforts demonstrated that institutional change was possible when individuals chose moral courage over career advancement. Commissioner Torres, Admiral Mitchell said during the announcement ceremony, your decision to prioritize justice over institutional loyalty helped transform a corrupt system into one that serves all citizens equally. That kind of moral leadership deserves recognition and emulation. Rebecca Santos graduated from law school with honors and joined the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division, specializing in prosecuting institutional corruption cases similar to the one that had launched her legal career. Her courage in documenting and reporting the assault on Dr. Mitchell had evolved into professional expertise in protecting other victims of systematic civil rights violations. The Mitchell family testified before Congress about needed reforms that would strengthen civil rights protections in judicial settings. Their experience had demonstrated how local corruption could exploit jurisdictional gaps to operate with impunity, requiring federal legislation that closed those gaps and established clear accountability mechanisms. Members of Congress, Admiral Mitchell testified, our family had resources and connections that most victims of institutional corruption lack. The reforms we're advocating would ensure that all families receive equal protection under law, regardless of their ability to command military or political support. Dr. Mitchell had returned to her pediatric practice with renewed purpose, expanding her community health programs while serving as a national advocate for civil rights enforcement. Her assault had been transformed from personal victimization into a catalyst for protecting the vulnerable children and families she had dedicated her career to serving. The children I treat shouldn't have to fear the institutions that are supposed to protect them, she told the American Academy of Pediatrics during their annual conference. When we reform corrupt systems, we're protecting the most vulnerable members of our communities. Marcus Jr. delivered the keynote address at the Naval Academy's annual honor conference, speaking about how military principles of honor and accountability could transform civilian institutions when applied with strategic precision and moral clarity. His experience witnessing his parents' campaign for justice had shaped his understanding of how institutional power could be used to protect rather than oppress.
Honor isn't just a military virtue, he told his fellow midshipmen. It's a national necessity that requires each of us to choose justice over convenience, truth over comfort, and systematic reform over individual advantage. Master Chief Washington's retirement ceremony included recognition for his role in mentoring Admiral Mitchell through the campaign that had transformed institutional corruption into systematic reform.
His 30 years of military service had concluded with helping achieve the kind of lasting change that military service was intended to protect and preserve. "Admiral," Washington said during their final official meeting, "this campaign proved that military principles can transform civilian institutions when applied by people who understand that true victory requires permanent change rather than temporary advantage." The legacy of the Mitchell family's fight extended beyond their personal vindication to systematic changes that protected countless other families from similar victimization. Federal courts nationwide implemented standardized procedures that prevented discriminatory treatment, while law enforcement agencies faced enhanced oversight that made networks like Crawford's impossible to operate. 1 year after the assault that had nearly cost Dr. Mitchell her life, the family attended the dedication of the Mitchell Center for Civil Rights Enforcement at the Norfolk Federal Courthouse. The center would train law enforcement officers, court personnel, and legal professionals in recognizing and preventing the kind of institutional corruption that violated constitutional rights. "This center represents our commitment to ensuring that what happened to my wife never happens to another family," Admiral Mitchell said during the dedication ceremony. "Justice isn't achieved through individual punishment. It's achieved through institutional transformation that makes systematic oppression impossible." As the ceremony concluded, the Mitchell family could see that their personal tragedy had been transformed into lasting institutional change that would protect the most vulnerable members of society from the kind of systematic injustice they had confronted and overcome through strategic action guided by moral principles and military precision. The fight for justice had required sacrificing their privacy, risking their careers, and enduring systematic retaliation from corrupt institutions. But their victory had established precedents that would ensure other families received equal protection under law, regardless of their race, economic status, or political connections. Justice had prevailed not through individual vengeance, but through systematic reform that transformed institutions designed to protect the powerful into institutions that served all citizens equally under the Constitution their military service had sworn to defend. 2 years after Derek Kozlov's taser sent 50,000 volts through her body, Dr. Amara Mitchell stood at the podium of the renovated Norfolk Federal Courthouse, addressing an audience that included federal judges, civil rights leaders, and military officials who had gathered to commemorate the nationwide implementation of the Mitchell Protocols. "When I walked through those security doors 2 years ago," she began, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had sustained her through months of recovery and testimony, "I was simply a mother supporting my stepson. I never imagined that my assault would expose a network of corruption that had operated with impunity for decades, or that our family's fight for justice would create lasting change that protects countless other families." The bronze plaque beside the courthouse entrance read, "Mitchell Center for Civil Rights Enforcement, dedicated to ensuring equal justice under law through institutional accountability and systematic reform." The center had become a national model for training law enforcement officers, court personnel, and legal professionals in recognizing and preventing the kind of institutional corruption that enabled her assault. Admiral Marcus Mitchell received the Presidential Medal of Freedom for civilian service, an honor that recognized how military principles of strategic planning and institutional accountability had transformed civilian law enforcement oversight. His acceptance speech focused not on personal vindication, but on the ongoing responsibility to protect democratic institutions from those who would corrupt them. "Military service taught me that true victory requires systematic change, not temporary advantage. Our campaign succeeded because we understood that individual punishment without institutional reform simply allows new networks of corruption to develop. Lasting justice requires permanent transformation of the systems that enable injustice. Marcus Jr., now a senior at the Naval Academy, had become a prominent voice for civil rights within military circles, speaking regularly about how honor and accountability must extend beyond military service into civilian leadership. His essay, Military Honor as Civilian Responsibility, had been published in the Naval Institute Proceedings and was required reading in leadership courses across the service academies. Rebecca Santos, now a federal prosecutor specializing in civil rights violations, had successfully prosecuted 12 cases involving institutional corruption similar to the Norfolk network. Her courage in documenting and reporting the original assault had evolved into professional expertise that protected other vulnerable citizens from systematic abuse. Master Chief Washington's retirement ceremony included recognition for his role in mentoring the campaign that had become a case study in how military leadership principles could transform civilian institutions. His final official act was establishing a scholarship fund for young people pursuing careers in civil rights enforcement. Admiral, Washington said during their final official meeting, "This campaign proved that the oath we took to defend the Constitution applies whether we're wearing uniforms or civilian clothes. Honor doesn't end when military service ends. It evolves into civilian responsibility." As the commemoration ceremony concluded, Dr. Mitchell returned to her expanded pediatrics practice, which now included a civil rights clinic that provided legal assistance to families facing institutional discrimination. The children she treated would grow up in a system where courthouse security protocols prevented discriminatory treatment, where law enforcement oversight included meaningful accountability, and where institutional corruption faced systematic federal prosecution. The Mitchell family had transformed personal tragedy into lasting institutional change that proved that strategic leadership guided by moral principles could overcome even the most entrenched corruption. Justice had prevailed through honor, strategy, and the unwavering commitment to ensure that constitutional principles protected all citizens equally under law. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.